All right, so today we are going to throw a taller cylinder and then make it into a vase or a bottle. And so this involves a lot of different steps. It's going to really push you a little bit, meaning that we're going to throw with more clay. So it's going to physically tax you a little bit, meaning that since you're throwing with more clay, everything takes longer, takes more energy. And so it's okay if you don't get this the first time, right? Because it's not just throwing, like you are actually having to kind of build up some stamina in order to do this really efficiently. So it may take you a few times in order to get this. So when you're trying to throw a bigger piece of clay like this, it's all about how you start, right? And how you prepare the clay. A lot of it has to do with that. So what do I mean? I mean that, well, if you start with the same amount of clay and you're pretty efficient at throwing a smaller amount of clay, like you can make a pretty good cup, no matter how good you are, if you only start with like pound or two of clay, you're only going to end up with something fairly small, right? So that's okay, but in order to get bigger, there comes a point where you just got to start with more clay. And that allows me to get a much taller cylinder, much wider cylinder. And then the scale of everything I make gets bigger. And then your voice changes a little bit. What you can do with the clay changes. And this is really important because if you learn how to do this, then when you go back to throwing cups and everything, it'll be much, much, much easier. Because then you'll build up the strength and the stamina in order to throw a bigger piece of clay. And then when you go back to centering smaller piece of clay and doing regular size things, then you can just almost muscle it in the center. Also, you'll pick up new centering skills by doing bigger pieces of clay, that some of the faults and things that you're getting away with, some slightly bad habits, will kind of be amplified here. And then you'll have to train those out of yourself in order to center a bigger piece of clay. So then once again, when you go back to the smaller piece of clay, you'll be so much better. It'll be like a cakewalk. So I'm starting today with a 7-pound ball of clay. I'm not asking you to start with that much. I'm just starting with that much so I end up with something. But think about what size of clay you feel comfortable with. Like if it's 2 pounds of clay or 3 pounds of clay, then if that's what you feel comfortable with, then double it, right? So for me, I'm starting with this amount of clay, right? And so if you feel comfortable with 6 pounds, go to 12 pounds, right? And then the same thing happens, right? So I start with what I call really good clay. So what does that mean? It means that clay that's fresh, new clay out of the bag. You want to start with your best clay that you can, right? That if you're using reclaimed clay or clay that you just threw, it's really hard because that clay, you have to wedge it up a million billion times for it to get back into some sort of good clay state. And that just wears you out. So new bag clay for right now is always the best, right? For what we have. So I always start with new bag clay because I know that that came out of their big machine at the clay mixing place, and so it has no air bubbles, and I wedged it like crazy a little bit, did my wedging so that it is nice and happy. Also, since this is going to be a really physical activity, I want to make sure that I am in good shape, meaning like I got some sleep last night. I didn't just run a marathon or bale lots of hay or something physical or help tear down my neighbor's house or help them none of those super physical things, because if you're already kind of sore and beat up or mentally stressed out, it's really hard to really focus on this, right? Because this is going to push you a little bit, right? And it's better if you're not already pushed in another area in your life. So if that's going on, if you're sleepy, if you're whatever, kind of work on regular stuff and save making big stuff for another day. That makes sense to everybody. And so the other point is you just got to do it, meaning that you don't get better at throwing big pieces of clay until you really just start throwing bigger pieces of clay. And so if this is something, your dream is always to make taller things and try to make them beautiful, and you just got to do it. There's no you can't just sit at home and mentally work this out, right? And if your dream is to throw a 25-pound bag of clay, to get a bag, make this big 25-pound ball and throw it on there and throw it, you just got to work your way up to it. 7 pounds for a while, then do 12 pounds for a while, then do 15 pounds for a while. And then before you know it, like a few months from now, if you devote your life to it, you will be able to throw down a 25-pound bag of clay and make a 25-pound pot. But it's a little bit like running a marathon. You just don't step outside and run a marathon. You have to work your way up to it. That makes sense? All right, so I have my ball of clay. Mentally, good space. I know it's good clay. I just cut it out of the bag. I wedged it up a bunch of times. Sometimes if I just get tired from the wedging, sometimes I'll wedge it up and then put it back in a bag and go have lunch or something and chill. Because sometimes just wedging makes my arms all beat up and tired. So you can do that too. You can wedge it up and then go do something else and then come back and then come back to throw. I have it on a bat, mentally spaced good. I have all my tools here. I just slap her down just like normal. Now, if I'm gonna spend a lot of energy just trying to center this, okay? So, all right, so now I'm gonna take some time and try to slap it in the center, meaning I wanna get this piece of clay centered as much as possible before I even add water to the clay. Because once I start adding water to the clay, there's like a ticking clock, right? Once this gets soaked with water, it's going to keep getting wetter and wetter and wetter, softer, softer, softer. And as it gets softer, the clay won't want to stand up as much anymore. So I want to spend as much time doing this. So I cut my hands and I'll slap it into a centered mass like this. You see that? So if the clay is way off on one side, I'll just spend more time hitting it on that side to kind of get it into the middle. So ideally, if you were like a really good person and your karma and everything was all like in alignment or chi or whatever that day, right, you would almost be able to get this perfectly centered, right? Now that doesn't always happen, right? But you do your best, right? So you can see that I've partially got it a lot centered. You see there's a little bit of wobble right there. So I'm gonna spend some time hitting that section in, right? Because the more I can do here, the better off I am. Oh, it's getting better. All right, so there. So now that's pretty well centered, but not quite, so I can center the rest. So then we just go for it, add water, and it's pretty well down, right? So add water to this big mass. Now, tip number next, I don't even know what number we're on, right? This is a bigger piece of clay. So the general rule is the smaller the piece of clay, the faster your wheel speed for centering. The bigger the piece of clay, the slower you have to go. So why is that? Well, let's think about a smaller piece of clay. I can have the wheel going really fast and I can just muscle it and hold myself tension and the clay will just kind of naturally center itself, right? But this bigger piece of clay, I can't resist. It'll end up moving me around, right? Pushing me. So I have to go slower and I feel the clay starting to push me away and I have to have time to react to push back. I'm not strong enough to push back against the clay without thinking about it, right? So I have to go slow, right? And squeeze the clay and go slow like this as I go up, right? And it takes a long time to get up to the top comparison to how long it took you before, right? So there, and that requires lots of core muscles and me squeezing it a lot, right? And that's a lot of pressure, and then I can go back down. And you can see that I basically use the same technique that I teach you guys in Ceramics 1 for this, right? So there's a reason for that, because I like to use my technique of throwing. I changed it in order to throw bigger things. So the way I throw is the way how I like to center taller, bigger, because I made that a priority in my life when I was a younger undergrad student. So I changed the way how I throw so that my throwing technique fits for when I want to do taller things, right? So you can see that my hand position, everything's the same from when I'm centering littler stuff, right? You can already see it's actually looking pretty good. So now this actually looks kind of too easy, right? For you, you don't really see how hard it is. It actually takes me a lot of force and I'm really holding steady. There's gonna be a lot of stuff that comes off on your hands. Just keep scraping that off, right? And putting that into the bucket, right? So we'll do it up one more. Oh, it's not quite centered. So the hardest part to center is right here. So if you're having trouble centering the piece, just kind of do that 1 or 2 times and then just focus on the top half. Trying to get that, because remember that we doubled the amount of clay that you thought you're good at, right? So now I'm just gonna, no matter how off center this part is, I'm just gonna center this part. You see that, how I go up like that, and I just cone that part and I'll push that back down. You guys see that? So this is critical. Even though this is all mostly centered, I raise that up and then push it back down. And so now this, hopefully that part is more centered, and then I'm going to go down to here and go a little bit lower, right? Pretend that's the base, so I'm going to go here. You see that? So I'm up a little bit from, and I go, oh, and I really tighten down, and I go up like that. So I'm actually squeezing pretty hard like that, and I slowly release, and so hopefully that centers that bit, right? And then I push it back down. Right now I can do the whole thing, I think. Now I'll squeeze that. Now you may spend several times at one level going up and down, getting it centered. This may take you a bunch of times, right? To squeeze up and go down, up and go down, up and go down, right? And you may get worn out, right? It's okay to stop at any time, take a break, right? If you're getting worn out, because we still got a lot of physical action to do, right? So I'm gonna squeeze here from the bottom, and I'm going, oh, this is always the hardest part to center by long ways, right? And we all know that. This is always the hardest, so I'm just gonna squeeze. I'm gonna spend some time down there squeezing, holding, right? And I can feel my core muscles like flexing as I do this. And then I go up, just like I am raising regular, right? And I slowly work it way up. Right? Any soft stuff that comes off on my hands, I degoopify and put into the bucket. Right now, some people will teach you to reapply it back down. You can do that as well. I can put the goopy stuff rather than using water all the time. I don't really care, right? It's more important to get it centered than thinking about how much water you're using. You can figure out water amount if you're using a lot of water, a little water later. So I'm going to check here. That's pretty well centered. You see that on all levels. It's a little bit of a wobble up here. Let's see if we can fix that. Right? It's looking pretty good. So now I've been thinking about squashing it back down for the opening. So I know that from the cylinder I want to probably make that this is just too wide. Right? Why is that? Well, because if my cylinder is really wide, that goes up, that means I'm probably going to end up with a shorter cylinder. For me, this time I want to emphasize height more than width. So I am going to take this part and just mash that clay in like that, like this. You see, I'm just collapsing that clay, and this takes some strength, right? And I slowly relax. And if that knocks this part off center, then you should recenter again. That makes sense? So I'm going up and recentering, and I'm coming back down. All right, so now I'm gonna do the prep for opening. So this width of my clay blob is gonna be the width of my cylinder about, right? So that's okay. And for me, I have to think about my width of my hand and how big my hand is when I'm trying to get it in there, right? So I can't make a cylinder that's that wide, that's really tall, because I can't get my hand in there, right, to raise it later. So for me, this is what I like to do, like about that wide. Now I'm going to take off this blobby clay, put it in my clay bucket, flatten it out. So you see how tall my mound is, right? You see proportionately it's pretty tall compared to what we would normally do. I want to get a good look at that side. If I can get it, it's all backwards. There. So you see that how it's pretty tall in comparison to. So now what I'm going to do is it's flat, so I'm going to start opening. So let's do an opening rate pass here. So here I'm going to curl my fingers over. I do everything just like I do when I'm normal, right? I curl my hand over. I'm going to put pressure down there, right? That's the wrong one, that one, right? There like that. I'm pushed straight down. I don't know, it's not that fast, right? I'm not going super fast, right? Slower is better even here, right? Because if you start getting pulled off, if you feel it starting around, you can compensate. So this, just like when I'm centering, right? If I feel myself starting to get pulled around, I want to pull back against that, right? And hold steady as I go down. So if it's trying to push me around, when it tries to push me more, I push back a little bit, right? And as it relaxes, I relax a little bit. So I want this bore hole to be down the middle, right? So I'll go down a little. But then we get to a point where it starts feeling a little strange, right? where I go down, I start getting a little bit uncomfortable. The space starts getting kind of tight. So what I do then is I'll stop for a second and put like a false bottom. You see I'm widening that a little, right? And I'll stop for a second, and then that gives me more space to get back down and keep going down, right? So how far do I go down? Well, you got to think about how big a foot you want, how thick a bottom you want, right, on this sucker. So let's stop way early. And in general, the bigger the thing, right, the thicker, I would want to maybe leave a slightly thicker amount of clay down here as I get bigger. So let's measure. This is going to be way too much, I think. So let's just check it and see. Oh, that's so much, right? That's like 2 fingers width almost, right? So let's go down a little bit deeper and then pull straight back, and let's check it out again. Go down and see. So that's looking a little better. So normally when we do cups and stuff, I say pinky, right? But you see how that's a little bit bigger than a pinky width, right? So I'm okay with that. So that gives me more clay to trim off, a thicker bottom, because the pot is going to be bigger and taller than a normal thing. So now I have to widen. So when I widen, I have to reach way down there and curl my fingers over and pull straight back. So the length here is way down in there. So it's a little bit harder to do, but I will brace my other hand on top like this and pull back together. You see that? And then I'll pull straight back. Let's see if I can see what's going on. There we go. I'm looking. All right, so that's enough right there, and I slowly relax. Now, I want to flatten out and deal with this bottom now, because as it gets taller, right, I won't be able to see it anymore, right? If it gets taller, I won't be able to get to the bottom anymore. It'll be super hard for me to see the bottom. That makes sense? So I want to flatten out the bottom now by doing some of that action, by just going in there and pressing. And I'll use some sponge here on the side of the clay that's spinning away. All right, so there, we want to clean that up. And we could do what we call some compression down there, which some people love to do. So I'll take this rib and compress the bottom a little bit. All right, so here we go. Press. So this would be a good time to take a break, right? Because I'm transitioning from centering and opening to raising, right? And raising requires you to be the most focused, because it takes a lot of strength to center, but you can kind of grit that out. But now when raising, this is always the part where people get a little bit questionable. So if you were going to take a break, like it was taking you a really long time, this would be the time maybe to take a small, like, pit stop, go to the bathroom, have a sandwich or something. All right, so now what are we gonna do? So we always now wanna be careful that we wanna keep this, we wanna have like good cylinder management. So what do I mean? We wanna make sure that the cylinder is either straight up and down or going inward a little bit. The top is narrower. So this is, see how it's slightly overhung here? I'm just gonna take this whole thing and push it inward like I am trying to center it to kind of oomph that back in a little. See that, how that oomphed a little in? And just by doing that, I'm able to get a little bit of height out of that cylinder already. So you see that, how that, and now you can also see how that cylinder is like canted in a little bit. The top is a little bit narrower than the bottom. And that helps make the cylinder really strong, right? So you can think about when you stand on an empty soda can, right? You're able to stand on it, right, very carefully, and then when someone puts a kink on it, it just collapses, like you do that stabby trick from the sides. Same thing with this. If these walls are straight and unkinked, it's going to be very strong, okay? Can you imagine if that Coke can or where that soda can was canted in a little bit, right, where the bottom was bigger than the top, it'd even be stronger, right? It'd even be able to handle more pressure. So that's why we push that in a little. Okay, so I wet the entire surface down. And from now on, I'm going to be very concerned about thickness, evenness of the wall thickness all the way down. From top to bottom, I want to keep the whole, thin out the wall all together. Okay, so I'm going to squeeze at the bottom and try to raise, just like normal, except I'm going to do this technique. You see how my outside finger, normally I throw with my fingertips pressing. My fingers are not strong enough to do this next part. So what I do is I stick my index finger out and I curl it over. You see how it's like that, sticking out. See how it's sticking out? And then I'll bring my thumb over the top like that. Do you see that? To help lock it in place. So that pressure helps make this really sturdy. And I'm gonna push with that kind of blobby part, right? That little bit of flesh, right? It's right there, it's flat, but as I curl this over, there's like a chunk of flesh that like sticks out there. I'm gonna use that and push that against the side of the outside. And I can really drive into the wall with that to help give me a nice steady force to push against my inside fingers, right? So, and remember that my inside fingers will be higher, my outside knuckle will be lower, right? I'm pushing together and then I'll raise it up. I have to push with quite a bit of force down here to get any of this clay to move. And then as I raise up, I lessen the force. Now, when I feel this, it's a little bit thicker down here, so I'm for sure gonna push lots harder at the bottom. So I wanna wet the whole thing down, top to bottom. And I push here, and it's curled over like this, and I'm pushing in, and I'm gonna push out from the inside. And you see I'm connecting my two like that. You see that? So they can work together, right? So I'm touching there. I would do something like this, but I can't because that doesn't give me enough space, right? This kind of tops out there, so I gotta connect over like that. You see that? So here I push in from the outside, push out from the inside, and I go up. Squeeze, squeeze. I wait till I get a kind of a steadiness, and then I start raising. So I really wet the cylinder down, right? And I raise, raise. And so I'm pulling up a lot of clay, and now I can feel the clay. I'm relaxing a little bit, relaxing a little bit, relaxing a little bit, relaxing a little bit. And now I slow the inside hand down, let the outside hand catch up. Now I got this little burr funkiness of clay. We're just gonna cut that off. That's just like a layer of clay that was gonna come off anyway, so that goes away. All right, so here we go. So now we'll go again, right? So I'm gonna check here. What am I really checking for? When I look inside, I want to make sure the top and bottom are even, right? That I'm not ending up with a top that's thicker than, or top that's thinner than the bottom. So you can see here, it's even, right? You can see that inside and outside are even all the way down. If it wasn't even, let's say the bottom part was thicker, then this next throw, I really focus on squeezing the bottom more to get it to raise up and thin out this section down here, the bottom section. Because evenness right now is way more important to form a good habit by making an even cylinder than making a tall cylinder or whatever. If you always make an even cylinder, tall cylinders will come later, right? It's just a good habit. You'll be able to, as your skill level improves, you will get better at making cylinders. So we'll go again here. So I squeeze here. I do the same technique. Push from inside outside. Push, push, and I raise up like that. And so I have to relax. I have to relax right about here because I don't want to thin the top out too much. Right? And then I relax, relax, relax. So once again, I need to think about checking now to make sure that the top and bottom are even. So how would I do that? Just let's say I'm not quite sure. I'll get my needle tool out, right? And what I'm gonna do is poke in to the inside so you can see the needle tool sticking out there, right? And then what I'm gonna do is push the needle tool back out to the surface, and then I'm gonna check, and that's how thick it is right there. Right, you see that? And then what I'll do is I'll do the same thing a little bit farther down. I'll check, ooh, it's about the same, that's good. And I'll check way down there near the bottom, push the needle tool back out. So I use that to check it. So you can see that it's about the same from top to bottom, which is good. And so soon and then don't worry about those holes. Those holes will just disappear when I do the next raising pass. So here we go, one more. So now this starts to get a little bit tall, right? So as I'm raising, this starts to get up in here and it's harder for me to hold still. So eventually what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna stand up and raise this way. So I need to move this other camera a little bit out of the way and we'll just bend it back this way. So it's not in my, so this top camera view is gonna be a little strange from now on. So I'm gonna stand up here, and so I'm standing up and I'm gonna lean my legs against the wheel, and then I'm gonna raise from down here. I'm reaching down to do my raising pass, and I wanna hold my arms close to me and I raise up like this. Because as the cylinder gets taller and taller, my body's way out of position up here. I'm very weak like this, right? I have no stability like this. So if I can stand up and do this, I can still deliver a lot of strength, right? And that puts the top of the cylinder closer to my proper zone. And then I keep my foot on the pedal over here to control it. Right, so I'm standing up and I wet the whole thing down. Oh, I also keeping track of the cylinder, if the cylinder is flaring or not, right? So if it's flaring outward, I will do adjustments by squeezing it in and making sure that it's going straight up and down or canted inward a little bit. So the top would be narrower, right? But I want the cylinder to be as straight as possible at all times. You see that? All right, so I wet the whole thing down. So this one I'm going to really go for it. I'm going to really make it happen. Now it's hard sometimes to get the whole surface wet, so I'll use a sponge maybe and sponge the inside like that. You see that? Like that, and that makes the whole inside wet. I can sponge the whole outside. All right, so now I'm going to stand up and we'll turn this camera around a little bit and point it down. Where is it? Where are we? There we go. So we'll do that, and then here we go. So I'm going to come in here. I'm really leaning in close, right? My hands need to be separate now because that's too far down, right? I can't connect them at all. Maybe if I did that, I could do it, but then I'd be very fingertippy. I'm very weak. So I'm going to start with my hands separated, and then when I can, I'm going to join my hands together, okay? So I'm leaning against the wheel with my knees. I'm really pushing in. So here we go. Push. Push, and up we go. So I'm trying to be super steady as I go up. This is a slightly different position, so it might take you some practice to get this, to figure this out. And then I really have to let up the pressure because I'm very tempted to just crank it here because I could get a lot of height pretty quickly out of this cylinder if I wanted to. There we go, and I slowly relax, there we go. So you see how I was able to make it much taller, right? That was my first kind of aggressive, that was my aggressive kind of pull. We're gonna back that off a little. So then, so you see how there's now a slight waver in it, right? So it's narrow here, and then it's flaring out here. I need to fix that before I do anything else. So I'll push this in, right? That, you see that? So I collared it in, and then I'll do this. I can do the needle check all the way down, but I can tell that it's a pretty even cylinder all the way down. So we'll just look at it this way, right? You can see that it's pretty even. It's not really flaring out. That's what I want to see always. So now we're going to just do one more raise. So it's still pretty thick, right? I'm not that excited about how thick it is. So I think I can get one more raise. There's a slight like bow in here a little bit. It's flexing in. This is a little bit narrow. So I'm going to use my finger here and push that area out. All right. So we'll do one more raise here. So I wet the whole thing inside and outside here and just spilling water so that water gets all over the place. So here we go. We'll do one more raise and then we'll be good to go. So I'm standing up again, doing the same thing. This time I might use my fingertips because this clay is getting thin enough that it should be able to move with just my fingertips now. There we go. Here we go. Come on. There we go. So I got a purchase and then we'll go up. So I'm trying to be super steady. You see how I'm not going too fast. I'm watching the clay, right? Watching how it's doing down there. Slowly raising it up. Now I'm gonna have to let up the pressure here or else end up with a super thin cylinder up here, right? It's very tempting to try to thin this area, this top like third, top quarter of the cylinder out too much, right? You don't wanna do that until the very end if you need to, right? So that's a pretty good size cylinder. I'm pretty excited about this cylinder. Right now, if I wanted to make this cylinder taller, I could just raise this part now. Right? So why don't I just thin that out at the beginning or whenever, right? You want to leave it even all the way down because that means that your cylinder has strength. Because the issue is, what are we worried about is it collapsing, right, while I'm making this, because I'm trying to make it stand up all the way up in the air. That ball of clay, right, started way down here, and I'm really trying to force it up to here. The problem is that it wants to fold up and collapse, right? So having a strong base is important, but also keeping this part strong is also important until you don't need it to be anymore. So I'm gonna leave it all the same thickness all the way up and down, okay? So just, right, I could, if I knew I just wanted it to be a cylinder and I didn't need to shape it, I could thin out this top part a little bit more and get a bunch more height out of it, but we're not gonna do that. So now what I want to do is finish this from the inside out. What do I mean? Well, if you look inside, there's all this water on the inside, right? So I want to clean up that water first, right? You see that? Because I'm dumping water, dumping water, dumping water. I haven't been managing that. So I'm going to take my sponge, wing it out, and clean all the water out, because this is the last time I get to really get in there, right? So remember that if I hadn't taken care of that bottom at the beginning, remember I smoothed it out, this would be a very difficult time for me to try to get in there and smooth that bottom out, right? So here I'm gonna go in there and smooth this bottom out, and not really smoothing, just trying to get out the water, right? So now it took me a long time, right, to throw this. So there's all this slop and goop on the outside and on the inside. I wanna scrape that off using 2 ribs. Any 2 ribs will work, right? And I go like this, and I'll push them against each other. Right, so there's a little bit of a bow out here, so we'll take care of that. I think that's got it. All right, so here we go. So I'm gonna go up. I'm not pressing too hard, and I go up together. Now, as I'm going up, I'll show you a little trick here, right? As I'm going up, we need to fix this because this is critical. As I'm going up with these ribs, right? Let's say I want to use a flat portion of the rib, right? I'd not have it flat. I actually turn it like that. You see that a little bit? So when it's turned, let's use this water bucket here. When it's turned, right, only the center part is touching, right? I'm really overemphasizing the turn, right? You see that how only the center part, it will be touching my cylinder, right, when I scrape up. So I can turn it or not turn it, have it more straight up and down, but only this center part of the flat part of the rib is touching. And that is super awesome for scraping these guys smooth, right? On the inside, I use a round side. Outside, I use the flat side, but it's slightly turned like that. You guys see that, how that's gonna be? So that allows, like, if I try to use the flat side going up, the flat side doesn't necessarily work because this isn't completely flat. And so it might be hitting up here, 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 and then you lose kind of control of it. So turn this guy a little bit, and you start way down at the bottom, and you work your way up. And what am I doing? I'm scraping off the soft clay. I'm also smoothing out the surface, removing the throwing line. So it's serving 2 purposes, because all this wet clay is not doing anything except making my cylinder more wet, parking wet clay onto the surface, right? And it also, the throwing lines are not necessarily something that I find that exciting to look at. For me, it's a little bit like leaving the canvas texture behind, right? For some people, the throwing lines are awesome. That's part of their creative voice. But for me, I would love it if the surface was blank, and then I can consciously put the first surface marks on there, either through glaze or surface decoration, right? Now, for some people, the throwing lines are an important part of the process, and leaving those throwing lines is part of the deal, right? It shows the record of how it was made, right? And that's another thing, but that's not my vibe, so I don't do that. So I may do this 3 or 4 times, right? So I'll go up one more time, and each time the surface gets a little bit smoother and a little bit drier, right? So this time I can feel it. I'm not hardly removing anything, right? And it's feeling pretty groovy, right? So not that much came off. All right, so now I am ready to, so let's look at the inside really fast, get a good close-up view of how the inside looks, right? So it's looking pretty smooth and happy in there. There's still some rib lines. If I really wanted to work this, I would really work it maybe a few more times to get rid of even those lines there, right? So, but now we're just gonna start shaping. So let's talk about what we want to make, right? So always, always, always think about what your pot or what you're going to make. Am I going to make a vase? Am I going to make a bottle? Am I going to make a form that's like these Greek vases that have a really high shoulder and come in? Is it going to be like a barrel shape where it's going to come symmetrically out, right? Where it just comes out the same way it comes in and it's like a barrel shape? Am I going to make it into a bottle? If I'm going to have a bottle or a vase where I'm going to have a neck or right of something where the element goes straight up again after it closes in a neck, I need to leave some clay to do that, right? So let's quickly just mark off some things. Now, this is not something I would normally do, right, on a pot, but we want to start thinking about how we use all this vertical surface, because all I've done so far is create this, right? This isn't really necessarily anything in particular yet. Now, this is where the John Hasegawa-ness or whoever, whatever your name is, comes into play, right? This is just a blank form for you to make something out of. So if I'm going to say, well, I want something that has a neck, like a bottle form that has a neck, I need to leave some clay untouched for now to do that. So let's just mark a line there, right? So you see that? So I'm making a line there. So let's say I'm going to leave that much clay to be the neck. Well, and then what sort of form or what do I want down here? So let's say it's a barrel shape. What I call a barrel shape, where it comes out and in at the same amount, right? And the widest point would be here, down here in the middle-ish. That makes sense? So I think about that. But maybe I don't want a barrel shape. Maybe I want the wide point to be higher than the middle. So then maybe the wide point could be there. And then it comes out fairly quickly and then comes in fairly slowly, right? Has a longer length. So you have to think about those things before you start. And that doesn't mean that you have to do it. Things could happen along the way, right, that could change your thinking, right? That would change what you want. You may be doing a barrel shape and it ends up being a slightly different shape. You're like, I'm cool with that, right? So let's just start with a barrel shape. So what is a barrel shape? I'm going to leave some for the neck to make the bottle and neck of the vase. So the barrel shape, that means the midpoint here will be the widest point, right? Also, sometimes you have a bunch of clay right here that ski jumps out, right? You see how that flares out? It would be nice if I could have the cylinder going straight down, all the way down. So I could use my clay knife and just cut this off flat here, right? And so that doesn't necessarily do anything that I couldn't have done with trimming later, right? But for me, visually, it helps me see what I'm doing down here. How is the form ending, right? And then I don't have to do as mental gymnastics to account for all that clay I was going to trim off later. Does that make sense to everybody? It just helps me see the form a little bit more cleanly, right? So here we go. So I'm just going to make sure that chunk, oh, and look, I put a big line there. All right. So now let's go ahead and start pushing the form out. So I do this thing called stretching, where I push the clay out with a rib. This surface is dry, so I don't add any more water to this surface for now. And I use the rib and I push out the side that's flowing away. So I'll be pushing out from the inside, pushing out to bulbous out this form. We start from the top of the form and work our way downward. And it's a thing called stretching. It's a little bit supposedly like inflating a balloon. So here I'll take this part of the rib, I'm holding it like this on the inside, and I'll be pushing it out. And I'll use my outside finger to point where I'm pushing. So here, and you'll be able to see it from where it's going, from where the bulge is. You see that? And then I go down, 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 there. So there, right? So now I push it out a little bit, and then each time I push it out, it becomes a slightly more chubby version of what it is before, right? So it's like boop, boop, boop. It's a little bit like inflating a balloon. So I didn't quite, if I wanted this to be a barrel shape where this part here is the widest, I want to establish that now. So push, and push, and push. And then maybe I let off on some of the pushing as I get down here. So you see that I'm starting to establish that as the widest point. And I push, 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 push as it's spinning. There we go. So you see how now that barrel shape is starting to happen, right? So now I begin to think, is that still what I want? Because I can still make it a high shoulder thing, or maybe I'll leave it as this barrel shape. Let me push it out a little bit more. Now the good thing about this is as I push it out, I get to see the form. It gets slightly closer each time, right? And I can stop at any moment. Like maybe this is exactly what I wanted. Now that I see it happening, I thought I wanted it bigger, but maybe this is it, but maybe not. So I'll keep pushing it out. I'm gonna be pretty aggressive on this push. There, I'll do it one more time. And as I'm pushing out, I'm rolling this rib down and around to kind of match the form. So here, now maybe I'm thinking like, ooh, this is starting to get close. So it seems a little bit weak in this shoulder, right? It seems a little flat there. So I'm gonna start dealing with it now because you see how the bottom looks pretty full, right? If I was gonna stop here, like that part looks good, this top part, this shoulder here looks a little weak. So, and this rib is a little big. I could try using this part of the rib and kind of pushing that up. So let's try that. Using the round, I'm pushing up a little bit. So I reach in there and I'll push this back up. You see that? And then maybe that's all I need and I can stop for a second. That looks okay. Let's try one more big push out. So you see how that looks better. I could stop there, but let's push it out one more time. There we go. And now you may think like, when do you decide to stop? You just figure it out, right? You just got to decide when. So that's looking okay. I'm happy with that form. Now, you notice I wasn't using any water because I was stretching. So now I have kind of this giant vase form, right? And I'm going to try to make it into a bottle, but we do the same thing that we did with this. We work this in slightly, we narrow it up a little bit at a time, right? So this we pushed up, boom, 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 right? This we're gonna push in, boom, 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 boom. Now the first thing we gotta do is add water. So you notice that before, we weren't adding any water at all for this. We always try to make sure this surface, this body is done before we work on the neck, right? That we're gonna add water to this. Ooh, it has a slight wobble to it. Wet a sponge down because we only want to wet this section here. We're just going to wet this section down. We're going to wet this part down. We don't want too much water dripping down. There we go, there we go. So now we could do this with our fingers. You see what I'm doing here? I take just kind of point your thumbs toward each other and bend your index fingers down. And then what we're going to do is to this pot, you see I'm going to use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 points of contact and squeeze in and then go up like that. Oh, it already dried out too much. So the clay needs to be super slick for this. So I'm wetting it down again. Squeeze in and I do this going up and that should allow it. See how it's sucked in a bunch, right? So we're going to do that again, I think. So what I'm doing is I'm thickening up the clay, right? The clay is getting smaller and smaller, right? Like that. And so I want to make sure my hands are super wet. Now I can't keep doing this forever because this clay starts getting thicker here. So I got to, after a bit, it begins to kind of fight back some. So then what I have to do is then come back with my sponge and wet this area down like that. And then wet the outside area, the inside area down a little bit. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to throw this thinner a little bit, but instead of using my knuckles or my fingers, like all my fingers, I'm just going to go fingertip, fingertip, and it's very light duty throwing. This area needs to be really slick for this. So I'm going to push in mainly from the outside, and then I'm going to put some resistance in there from the inside and do like a little raising pass to thin that out. You see that? There. So you see that how it just squirted up some? And then I might be able to get away with doing that twice. You have to get a feel for it. When do you need to raise it, like these fingertip raises, and when do you need to do the collaring in? So here I do fingertip maybe one more time. Let's see, push. So you're not necessarily trying to thin it out too much, but you're trying to make it thinner so that you can do this collaring in again, right? So you see how that got pushed in. And the way I've been very careful, right? I've been trying to push this in a way that makes sense for the rest of the form. Then I go back to squashing it back in again. So here I get my clay, my water like this, I do this. So you see how it happens slowly, right? So now I could do this technique where I collar it in again, right? Because now this is thinner. it'll be more susceptible to this and won't fight back as much. So I'll just sweep in and go whoosh like that again. It already dried out too much. I want this super slick. So this water it's absorbing water, right? And ideally you do this actually really fast without so much talking. You see how I jammed on the gas a little bit? You want the wheel to be going actually pretty fast, right? So why can I go fast? Because remember I was talking about larger amounts of clay, you want to go slow. But now I'm actually dealing with a very small piece of clay, so I can go faster. And actually trying to do this slow is really hard. You want some pretty fast speed. So now you have to assess, like this is starting to look a little strange here, right? You see how this transition is super awkward here, right? But I can't get my hand back in to push that out. Because I think ideally this part should be pushed out a little. Maybe this gets pushed in, but this is definitely too far down. Can't get my hand in there. Dun, dun, dun. That's where we bring our throwing stick in, right? This is like a rib with a stick on, right? Wouldn't it be great if they made these with a stick on the end that you could get in there and push out? That would be awesome. But they have these fancy things, and I'll put this hump here inside of there and push that part out, right? So I bring this guy in, right? And so really what I'm going to do here is push out like in there, right? And I could use this to shape the whole thing. If I could reach it, I could use it as a rib all the way down to the bottom if I wanted to. But hopefully this part's looking okay, right? We established that already. So this, we wet that down, and I'm just going to start pushing up here. Start pushing that out to bring that back out. Oh, you see that, how that's starting to look. Now, because I did that, I might have pushed this too far out. So luckily, when you push something too far out, you can always just push it back in a little bit, right? So here, we'll get a rib here, and I'm just gonna push this because it feels like this is too far bumpity out, right? So I'm just gonna take my rib here and just slowly, gently push that area in. Like that, I don't know, right? It's a little bit of trial and error, right? Because as a new vase maker, you just got to see what you like. So this area now looks a little flat. I was suspecting that's what would happen. So I'll reach in with this again and try to get this bump opposite there and push that out a little bit. Now I'm doing this now because I'm about to close this in too much. So I won't be able to get this in there, right? So I'm trying to take care of these major changes well, because having room, it allows me to maneuver around with this hole. There we go. I think I got it. I think I got it. That looks better. All right, so that's feeling pretty good. So I'll come back with this and just smooth it out a little. Oh, that's looking, so those little changes of the form mean a huge difference, right? So a lot of people wouldn't, I didn't do much, but for me, I see it instantly what I did. So now let's continue closing this in. So when does a bottle become a vase or a vase become a bottle? Really, we just know, right? Through the closing of this, right? So let's think about this. Maybe we want it to be like a functional thing, right? Where it will store and we'll put a stopper in there. So this doesn't look quite right yet. So I think I need to close. This part looks a little too fat. So I'm just gonna push in from the outside to see. And then as I'm pushing in, I'm letting my finger travel up so that I'm trying to follow this line here that I already established as I go up. And I'm only using one finger because you don't want hardly any friction on this, because any friction will start ripping this clay apart. Ooh, you see that? Now, little changes, very, very small changes mean a lot for this form, because this is like the finishing flourish, right? And how people see this whole form, this will change it right here. Does it look kind of clumpy? Does it look elegant? Does it finish does it have the broad, widening energy? So let me close this in just a little bit more and we'll see the difference. So I'm gonna really wet my fingers down and then I'm gonna go like that again. Let's see if I can just push in. right? See that? I just did that. Oh, you see that? Oh, right? And then oftentimes you make little changes like that and you can't stop yourself. You got to think, well, that was so awesome. I'm going to try it again, right? So this time I can barely reach in there. So I'm going to try to throw maybe one more time like this. See if I can reach down to this part and throw this a little thinner. And then you'll see that I'm able to get a lot of length out of that, right? And that as I do that, that changes it, right? So I feel like this is getting close to done, right? So as a person, I need to, as the artist, I need to think about how I transition from body to shoulder to neck to rim, right? So right now, let's finish it first as a very smooth transition where it kind of just does like this S curve that has no breaks. Well, look at these ribs have these giant smooth curves. I can just smash it in there a little bit. As long as the curve is kind of close, right? I could just do that here, right? And do that around, right? And I can create pretty smooth transitions, right? From curve to curve, right? You see that how that I'm trying to, there's a little bit of an abrupt change here, but I could change that by flattening, by pushing this area in a little bit more. You see that, how I can do that? So see that how I'm slowly changing the curve, slowly, to fit what I need. If I push this area back down too far, guess what? I bring this guy back in, and I can still just barely get in here and push that out. Now, if I wanted to reach way out here, it'd be really difficult for me to get in there because I might be running into the side of this. But just in here, I think I could reach that area with that stick there. Oh yeah, right? That happens a lot where you flatten out a little bit too much. And then here, so you see how that has a fairly smooth curve down. So let's do a change on it. So we're close, right? But let's do something else where we put a very sharp break of the curve there. So let's do that and we'll see how the form changes. So right here, this is the narrowest part of the neck. Let's move the neck narrow part down here. I'll push, 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 push. So you see how I move the narrow part of the neck to the lowest part of the neck, and you see now that's a different sort of thing completely, right? As the energy changes. And then let's do one more change before we're done, is let's flare this neck out even more, right? So here, let's do this. Let's make it more trumpety. I can just kind of pull this area apart, right? And let it flare out a little bit. Now it flared out a little bit. It's looking kind of awkward, the flare. So let's see if we can make this part here go in a little bit more and then flare back out some. See, and so I want it, maybe I want it to be more trumpet-like, right? Like the way a trumpet kind of flares at the end of the thing. See, so you see that how it whoop, and it just really just jumps away at the end. Right, and then there's some cleanup things I would do, like I would clean up the surface, I would clean up the inside. I would also trim this area off, right? So we'll trim that. We'll do that for you here on camera. Right, so I'll take my needle tool and I'll cut that rim off. All the way through and lift that off. And then so this area is really dry, so I'll do that. Now, this clay up here traveled a long ways and it's had a long time of water and stuff. You got to be very gentle when working with necks, right? They're very soft clay by now, right? And then I'll get this guy, my chamois. Now there's some other work that I would probably keep working on this for a little bit longer to smooth out these transitions and stuff, but I think you guys get the idea, right? That's my bottle now. And then I would undercut it, right, way down here. It's very difficult. If it's really difficult to undercut, like if you don't have room, just take the tip of this and jam it under like that, just to undercut it that way. Or if you want to lessen your trimming time, you could just use the tip, right, and undercut it that way. Go all the way down to the bat and then cut this guy off. And the last thing would be to wire it off. There we go. So that's the vase bottle thing. Do you guys have any questions about that? So we'll trim this for you guys next class so you can see it. I don't expect you to make one this big, but all those lessons for making the cylinder, right, count no matter how much clay you're starting with. especially as you're starting with bigger pieces of clay, and then learning, right, how to control this form, right? How to push the body out. Planning for where you, how much neck you want, how much body you want. Planning for this, whatever shape that you want it to be. Having enough clay for doing both of those, right? And then bringing this clay in to form the neck, right, of the bottle. That makes sense to everybody? And it could be a vase, right? A vase is just wider,